My name is Robert. I am 72 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life on a pedestal, looking down on people. Not out of arrogance, but because of my job. I was the Chief Justice of Chicago, a man whose silence in the courtroom silenced the most dangerous criminals and the most eloquent lawyers. Now I sit in my office on the 40th floor of a skyscraper overlooking the gray, restless Lake Michigan. The wind blows against the panoramic windows with such force that it seems as if the building itself is groaning under the pressure. This office is in perfect order. Leather-bound books stand in a row. There is not a speck of dust on the table, and the air is filled with the smell of old wood and expensive cologne. But there is no life in this order. Over the past 40 years, I have handed down thousands of sentences. I have decided who is guilty and who is not, who deserves freedom and who will spend the rest of their days behind bars. I am used to my word being the law, not subject to discussion. But a year and a half ago, when Eleanor passed away, I suddenly realized that all this time I had been judging the wrong people. The real trial has only just begun, in the deafening silence of my penthouse. Now I am the only defendant, the only witness, and the only executioner. I am surrounded by luxury that no longer has any meaning. My awards on the walls look like a mockery, and the silence in the rooms presses on my eardrums more than the noise of any courtroom. All my life I have dictated rules to others, but now life has delivered its final verdict. Solitary confinement in a golden cage, where my only companion is my own past. Eleanor was my complete opposite, and that is probably why I chose her, or allowed her to choose me. She was a talented pianist, a woman with music in her fingers and infinite tenderness in her heart. We lived together for 45 years, but only now, looking at her closed grand piano in the corner of the living room, do I realize that I never really heard her. To me, she was the perfect judge's wife. She knew how to make impeccable small talk at receptions. She made sure my shirts were dazzlingly white, and she always greeted me with a smile, no matter how difficult my day had been. I took her presence for granted, like the air you breathe without noticing its composition. I remember evenings in our house when she would sit down at the piano and start playing Chopin. Those sounds filled the house with light, but I, immersed in studying another appeal case, often asked her to close the lid. "Eleanor, it distracts me from my work," I would say in my cold, impartial tone, and she would close it, without argument, without complaint. She would simply nod and retreat into the shadows, becoming a silent ghost in her own home. I considered emotions to be a weakness, an obstacle to a clear mind, and I demanded the same of her. I didn't notice how the music in her eyes gradually gave way to sadness, how her shoulders slumped under the weight of my indifference. She gave up her career, her passion, and her voice so that I could build my glass tower of success. I saw her as a beautiful frame for my mantle, but I never saw her as a living person who was slowly freezing next to me. Now that she is gone, I would give all my wealth, all my titles, just to hear one false note in her performance, just to see her open that piano again. But the house is silent, the very ideal order I always demanded. That rainy November Thursday will forever remain in my memory as the day when the justice I served handed down the harshest sentence to me. Eleanor had been asking me for a week to go to our country house by the lake. "Robert, the trees are almost bare. The first snow will fall soon. Let's just be together without phones and folders with cases," she said, standing in the doorway of my office. But I was, as usual, buried in work. On my desk lay a high-profile corruption case that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my career. I didn't even look up at her. "Go alone, Eleanor. I'll come on Saturday evening if I finish the hearing. Don't make a tragedy out of it," I said in my usual tone, which brooked no argument. She left alone. The road north was slippery from freezing rain and fallen leaves. The tragedy occurred on a sharp turn. Thick fog and an oncoming truck that didn't have time to brake. The news caught me right in the courtroom during the lawyer's closing statement. My secretary crept up to the podium and placed a note in front of me. I read it, and for a moment the world around me froze. The sounds disappeared, only the letters on the paper remained. Your wife, accident, doctors couldn't. My heart should have broken, but 40 years of judicial restraint worked like a steel corset. I slowly put the note in my pocket, listened to the speech, delivered the verdict to the defendant, and only after banging the gavel did I leave the courtroom. Only in the car, in the complete darkness of the garage, did I allow myself to grip the steering wheel so tightly that the leather upholstery creaked. I didn't cry, judges don't cry. I just stared into the void, realizing that on that Saturday, when I promised to come, no one would be waiting for me anymore. My career had reached its peak, but I had lost forever the person for whom this success had any meaning. Eleanor and I had 2 daughters, Sarah and Claire. I raised them the same way I conducted my trials, strictly by the rules without unnecessary sentimentality. I wanted them to be strong so they could survive in this harsh world, and I got what I wanted. Sarah became a brilliant prosecutor, and Claire became a tough corporate lawyer. But after their mother's death, I was horrified to see my own reflection in them. They came to my house the day after the funeral, dressed in strict black suits, their faces devoid of emotion, as if they had come not to mourn their mother, but to take inventory of her possessions. Instead of hugging them, feeling their pain and sharing mine, I began to treat them as if I were cross-examining them. I criticized Sarah for losing her last case and scolded Claire for her unfortunate choice of partner at the firm. I hid my grief behind my usual mask of criticism and tyranny. I thought I was helping them keep their composure, but in reality, I was just burning away the last remnants of warmth between us. You can't even be a father now, can you? Claire asked, her voice as cold and dispassionate as mine had been in the courtroom. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a prosecutor who had already gathered all the evidence of my guilt. I could see that they both despised my power because behind that power lay absolute emotional disability. I had raised 2 wonderful lawyers, but I knew nothing about these 2 women who were my flesh and blood. We sat in the living room, surrounded by Eleanor's belongings, and between us grew a chasm that no legal code in the world could fill. I had declared war on my own children, without even realizing that in this battle I had no chance of an acquittal. Chicago at Christmas turns into a fairy tale setting. The lights of the Magnificent Mile, the giant Christmas tree in Millennium Park, and the smell of cinnamon in the air. But in my penthouse, Christmas felt like the beginning of an ice age. It was the first year without Eleanor. She usually started decorating the house a week in advance, filling it with the smell of homemade baking and the sounds of classic hymns. This time, I just hired an agency. Professional decorators in gray jumpsuits set up a perfect, symmetrical tree in 3 hours, hung cold silver balls, and left. The house looked like a page from a catalog, flawless and completely dead. When Sarah and Claire arrived for dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. We sat at a long table, and the sound of silverware against porcelain seemed deafening. Instead of remembering something warm about my mother, driven by my inner demon of control, I made a fatal mistake. I began to comment on my daughter's personal lives, using the same tone of voice I used to read court rulings. I reprimanded Claire for her decision to take a vacation to go to the mountains, calling it a lack of professional discipline, and pointed out to Sarah that her leniency in her latest case was unacceptable for a prosecutor in my circle. At that moment, Claire, the youngest, most ambitious, and most like me, put down her fork abruptly. Her face, usually pale and calm, flushed with anger. You know, Dad, I've been thinking for a long time about why Mom cried so often when she thought we weren't looking, she said, her voice ringing like steel. I thought it was because she was tired, but now I understand. She cried because she was living with an iceberg. You're not a father, you're a function. You didn't love her, you just controlled her like you do all of us. I don't want to be part of your trial anymore. She got up, put on her coat, and walked out into the blizzard without looking back. Sarah remained seated, staring at her plate. She didn't leave, but her silence was heavier than any scream. That night, I realized that Claire had turned away from me forever. I saw it in her eyes. She had passed final judgment on me with no right of appeal. After Claire left and I had a difficult goodbye with Sarah, I was left alone surrounded by silver decorations. The silence in the house became unbearable, weighing on my chest and making it hard to breathe. To keep myself from going crazy, I decided it was time to get rid of the things that reminded me too much of the past. I called a moving service to send Eleanor's grand piano to a music school. I couldn't stand seeing that black lacquered coffin in the corner of the living room anymore. When two strong movers began to pull the heavy instrument away from the wall, one of the legs caught on the edge of the carpet, and the piano swayed violently. There was a dull sound, as if something wooden had hit the floor inside the case. I asked them to stop. Under the top lid, in the narrow space between the soundboard and the back wall, lay an old leather folder tied with a faded ribbon. It was Eleanor's personal diary, which she had kept for the last 30 years. I opened it, and the ground fell away beneath my feet. Every page was steeped in a loneliness I had never suspected. She wrote about how I would look through her at dinner, discussing articles of law, while she tried to tell me about her fears. Today, Robert didn't notice my new hairstyle again. He didn't notice that I haven't played in a month. My hands tremble from his coldness. I exist in his world only as an appendage to his mantle. I read about how she secretly supported her daughters when I pressured them, how she persuaded them not to hate me, making excuses for my cruelty. I love him, but this love is like trying to warm myself by a piece of granite, she wrote on her last birthday. I sat on the cold floor next to her piano and for the first time in my life felt my glass tower crumbling. I was a great judge, but I lost the most important case of my life. I was not the protector of my family. I was its destroyer. Sarah, kind and gentle Sarah, still called me in the mornings to ask how I was. But I knew she was only doing it out of pity, which I despised but now desperately needed. Claire no longer answered the phone. My family was broken, and the crack ran right through my heart. I never knew how to ask for forgiveness. In my vocabulary, that word was always associated with a defendant admitting guilt in the hope of a lenient sentence. But now that Claire's voice was no longer coming through my phone and her name had disappeared from my call log, I realized that no leniency was coming my way. I tried my usual methods. I called her secretary, ordered the most expensive flowers to be delivered to her office on Walker Drive, and even sent her a rare antique edition on corporate law. I tried to buy her attention, as I had done for decades, but the flowers came back wilted, and the books unopened. Claire had cut me out of her life with the same surgical precision with which I had once cut out weak arguments in my defense. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore and drove to her house. I stood on the snow-covered sidewalk, looking at her glowing windows. Laughter and music came from inside, a life in which I no longer had a place. When she came out to see her guests off, I stepped out of the shadows. "Claire, we need to talk professionally, without emotion." I began, and that was my fatal mistake. She stopped, and her gaze was so cold that I felt the frost creeping under my cashmere coat. "Professionally?" she asked. "Even now, you can't just be a father, Robert. You didn't come to ask how I was feeling after my mother's death. You came to regain control of the situation. But I'm not your subordinate, and I'm not your defendant. To me, you died the day you didn't go with Mom to the lake." She closed the door, and the sound of the lock clicked shut like the final blow of a judge's gavel. That night, I realized I had lost her forever. She was my most vivid reflection, just as unyielding, just as unforgiving. And therein lay my greatest irony. I had raised my own executioner. Left completely isolated by Claire, I became painfully dependent on Sarah. She was my only link to reality. She came every weekend, brought farm produce, checked my blood pressure, and patiently listened to my endless ramblings about old cases. I could see that it was hard for her. I could see the shadows under her eyes, but like a selfish, drowning man, I clung to her, demanding attention. I started calling her 5 times a day with made-up excuses. Sarah wasn't angry, she just smiled sadly. And in that smile I saw the same pity I had once seen in Eleanor's eyes. I became not a support for my eldest daughter, but a heavy burden, a living monument to her sense of duty. One day, when Sarah couldn't come because of a difficult trial, I decided to go for a walk alone. I went to Grant Park, where Eleanor and I used to walk with our little daughters 30 years ago. Chicago around me was living its bustling life. Tourists were taking selfies at Cloud Gate, children were running along the frozen paths, and couples in love were warming each other's hands in their coat pockets. I looked at them and felt like a ghost who had accidentally stumbled into someone else's party. I sat down on an icy bench and suddenly remembered how Sarah, as a 6-year-old girl, ran up to me with a drawing, and I, without looking up from my phone, said curtly, "Go to your mom, I'm busy." This scene flashed in my mind with such intensity that it took my breath away. I sat alone in the center of a huge city that once revered me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly afraid. Not of death, no, but of having lived my life without ever understanding the taste of simple human warmth. I looked at my hands, the wrinkled, old hands of a man who was used to holding power but never learned to hold the hands of his loved ones. That evening, a blizzard began over Michigan, but the worst cold was not outside, but inside my penthouse, where only perfect silence and the scent of Eleanor's perfume awaited me, gradually fading away, like my hope for redemption. The silence in my penthouse became palpable, like dust that had not been wiped away for years. Sarah continued to visit, but I could see her holding her breath when she entered the living room, as if afraid of being infected by my loneliness. One evening, I made a decision that was tantamount to surrender for the Chief Justice. I took out a sheet of paper and began to write a letter to Claire. Not on official letterhead, not on a computer. My fingers, accustomed to holding a heavy quill pen to sign sentences, now trembled as I tried to write the simple words, "Forgive me, I was blind." I sent the letter by courier, and the whole next day I sat by the window, not taking my eyes off the phone. I imagined her opening the envelope, her face softening. But in the evening, the courier returned. The envelope was unopened. On the side, her secretary had written, "The addressee refused to accept the correspondence." At that moment, I felt a physical pain in my chest, stronger than any heart attack. It was my own judgment coming back to me like a boomerang. I realized that Claire wasn't just angry. She had built the same wall inside herself that I had built around her throughout her childhood. I myself had taught her to be ruthless, and now I was the first victim of her professionalism. That evening, I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind howling between the skyscrapers, and I understood. Some doors close forever not because the key is lost, but because there is no one behind the door anymore. Today, I turned 72. Sarah brought a small cake. We sat for 10 minutes in awkward silence, and then she left to go to her family, to her children, who barely know their grandfather. I stand at the window, looking at the lights of Chicago at night, which seem to me like cold stars in a foreign galaxy. In my hands is Eleanor's diary. I know it almost by heart. Every word she wrote is now a nail in the coffin of my self-importance. I was your honor to millions, but I was nothing to the woman who slept in the same bed with me for 45 years. My conclusion is simple and terrifying. Success that is not shared with loved ones is the most exquisite defeat. I have accumulated millions. I have earned certificates of honor, but I cannot buy a single sincere glance from my youngest daughter or a single morning when Eleanor would touch the keys of her piano again. I built an empire of paragraphs and laws, forgetting the main law of the universe, the law of mercy and presence. Now I am the master of a glass tower, where only the wind of memories blows. Don't repeat my mistake. Don't be judges to those who are waiting for a simple hug from you. Remember, at the end of the road, you will be left not with your titles, but only with those hands that want to squeeze yours in the dark. Robert's story is a stark reminder of how easy it is to lose everything when you have all the trump cards in your hands. We often hide behind our work, our status, or our own pride, believing that our loved ones will wait for us forever. But time is the strictest judge, and it does not accept appeals. Don't be cruel to those who love you. Leave your judgments and grievances at the door. Right now, after watching this video, write or call those with whom you are in conflict. Don't wait for the moment when your letter is returned unopened. If the story resonated with you, please let us know. Your support helps these important lessons reach as many people as possible. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our profound stories about human destinies. We are here to remind each other of what is most important. Write in the comments. Do you think Robert has a chance of being forgiven by Claire? Or has he gone too far? Share your thoughts, we read every comment. Share this video with your friends and loved ones. Perhaps these words will be the sign that saves someone's family from destruction. Cherish love while it's still around. Tomorrow may be too late.